Everyone's heard of George Patton. Most people think they know him. The brash general, the ivory-handled pistols, the slaps heard around the world, the speeches that made grown men feel like they could charge into hell barefoot and win. But the version of Patton that gets talked about in movies and history books is almost always the performance, the showman, the myth he built around himself on purpose, brick by brick, because he understood something that most military commanders never figured out. Reputation is a weapon, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a war is make the enemy afraid of you before the first shot is fired. What almost never gets told is the story of what happened when someone tried to use that same weapon against him. When a Nazi general, decorated, experienced, battle-hardened, and operating with the full backing of one of the most mechanized armies the world had ever seen, decided to test Patton, to intimidate him, to push him back through psychological pressure, tactical posturing, and the kind of calculated aggression that had worked on everyone else they'd tried it on. It didn't work, not even a little. And before we get into exactly what happened, how it unfolded, what Patton actually did, and why this moment matters far beyond one confrontation in one theater of war, I want you to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Because this is exactly the kind of story we dig into here, the real moments, the unfiltered confrontations, the turning points that don't always make it into the clean version of history. You're going to want to stick around. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand why a Nazi general trying to intimidate Patton was such a catastrophic miscalculation, you first have to understand what Patton actually was. Not the legend. The actual man. And the actual man was something that doesn't fit neatly into a single category. George Smith Patton Jr. was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family with deep military roots. His grandfather had been a Confederate colonel killed in the Civil War. His great-uncle had also served in the Confederate Army. He grew up surrounded by military history, military thinking, and military mythology. He didn't just admire soldiers. He believed, on some level, that most people would find strange or even unsettling, that he had been a soldier in previous lives. He believed in reincarnation. He believed he had fought at Troy. He believed he had marched with Caesar's legions. He believed he had ridden with Napoleon. He wrote poetry about it. Seriously. George Patton, one of the most feared combat generals in American history, wrote poetry about his past lives as a warrior. This is important not because it tells you something weird about Patton, but because it tells you something essential. He did not experience war the way most people did. He didn't fear it. He didn't tolerate it as a necessary evil. He embraced it. He loved it, with a kind of devotion that is genuinely uncomfortable to read about in the primary sources, because it's so total, so absolute, and so completely at odds with how we're told human beings are supposed to feel about mass-organized violence. He graduated from West Point in 1909, finishing in the lower half of his class academically, but he was never there to be an academic. He was there to learn how to fight. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, representing the United States in the modern pentathlon, which included pistol shooting, swimming, fencing, equestrian show jumping, and a cross-country run. He finished 5th overall. His weakest event was pistol shooting, which is one of those historical ironies that just keeps giving. The man who would become famous for his ivory-handled revolvers finished 5th in an Olympic shooting competition because the judges decided his shots that appeared to miss the target had actually gone through existing holes, a claim he disputed for the rest of his life. He served in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916, where he personally led what many historians consider the first motorized assault in United States military history, using automobiles to raid a ranch and kill 3 of Villa's men, including one of his top commanders. Patton killed one of them himself in a hand-to-hand struggle. He brought the bodies back, tied to the hoods of the cars. That is who we are talking about. In World War I, he became the first officer assigned to the newly formed United States Tank Corps. He was wounded in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, shot through the thigh, and lay in a shell crater for over an hour, while his orderly tried to keep him from bleeding out. He kept giving orders the whole time. When they finally got him to the rear, the doctors were amazed he was still conscious. Between the wars, he studied, obsessively. He read everything he could find about military history, about tactics, about the campaigns of every great commander, from antiquity to the present. He was particularly interested in German military doctrine, specifically the developing concept of blitzkrieg, which he understood almost intuitively in ways that most American officers simply didn't. He saw, long before most of his peers, that the next war would be a war of movement, of speed, of armored formations crashing through enemy lines before the enemy had time to respond. He wrote papers about it. He gave lectures. He argued about it in mess halls and officer clubs, and people thought he was a little bit much. They were right. He was a little bit much. That was the point. By the time the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, Patton was already something of a known quantity in the Army. Not universally loved, not even universally respected, at least not without reservation, but known. His superiors understood that whatever else he was a fighter. And in the early days of American involvement in the war, fighting was what they needed most desperately, because the early performance of American forces in North Africa had been, to put it generously, troubling. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 is one of those episodes in American military history that tends to get glossed over in popular accounts of the war because it was humiliating. The American Second Corps, poorly led, poorly coordinated, and largely inexperienced, ran into Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps and essentially fell apart. It was not a close contest. The Germans pushed through the Kasserine Pass, overran American positions, captured equipment, took prisoners, and inflicted over 10,000 casualties. It was the kind of defeat that shakes confidence, not just in leadership, but in the basic capability of an entire fighting force. Eisenhower's response was to remove the Atheten Corps commander, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, and replace him with someone who could not only win battles, but could rebuild the fighting spirit of a demoralized force in the shortest possible time. He chose Patton, and what Patton did in the following weeks was nothing short of a transformation. He arrived, imposed immediate and brutal discipline, uniform standards, training schedules, and the kind of relentless forward pressure that snapped the Corps out of its shock. Within weeks, the American Second Corps was a different animal, and the Germans were about to find out. But here is where we need to slow down and really understand the context, because the confrontation at the center of this story doesn't happen in isolation. It happens as part of a larger campaign, a campaign in which the Germans were operating under a specific set of assumptions about American forces, about American commanders, and about what American soldiers were capable of. And those assumptions were, in many ways, not unreasonable given what had happened at Kasserine. The German High Command in North Africa, by early 1943, had developed something of a contempt for American military capability, not for American industrial power, not for American logistics, which even the Germans grudgingly acknowledged was extraordinary, but for American fighting ability, for American tactical thinking, for American commanders. Rommel himself had written dismissively about American soldiers, calling them brave but badly led and lacking in the kind of ruthless aggression that made the difference in modern warfare. Other German commanders shared this assessment, and that assessment was about to create a very serious problem for one particular German general who decided to test it. The German officer at the center of this story is Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. And if Rommel was the face of German armored warfare in North Africa, von Arnim was the iron fist behind the lines, the experienced, calculating commander who had been brought in to take command of the 5th Panzer Army and, eventually, Army Group Africa after Rommel's departure. Von Arnim was not a flashy general. He was not a celebrity commander in the way Rommel had become. He was something in some ways more dangerous. He was professional, methodical, and deeply experienced. He had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred to North Africa. He had a precise tactical mind and a complete confidence in the superiority of German armored doctrine over anything the Allies could bring to bear. And in the spring of 1943, as the Tunisian campaign ground toward its conclusion, von Arnim made what would turn out to be one of the defining miscalculations of the North African campaign. He looked at the reconstituted American Second Corps, factored in the memory of Kasserine, and concluded that the Americans could be pushed around. That pressure, aggression, and tactical boldness could crack the American line, split the Allied forces, and buy enough time for German forces to either break out or, at the very least, negotiate from a position of strength. He did not fully account for what had changed. He did not fully account for Patton. Now here is where the story gets specific, and where we need to be precise about what intimidation means in a military context. Because when we talk about a Nazi general trying to intimidate Patton, we're not talking about someone walking up and staring him down across a table. We're talking about a coordinated pattern of military behavior designed to achieve a psychological and tactical effect, We're talking about probing attacks timed to create uncertainty. We're talking about the ostentatious movement of armored reserves to create the impression of overwhelming force. We're talking about the deliberate exploitation of the memory of Kasserine, the suggestion through action, and through the calculated posturing of formations that history was about to repeat itself, that if the Americans did not step back, they were going to be destroyed. It was a recognizable playbook. The Germans had run it against the French in 1940 with devastating success. They had run versions of it against the British at various points in the North African campaign. They had run it against the Soviets in the early days of Operation Barbarossa. It was a playbook built on the principle that fear, properly applied, is as effective as firepower, that an enemy who believes he is about to be overwhelmed will often behave as if he already has been. Patton's response to this playbook was immediate, total, and almost comically aggressive. He did not step back, he did not consolidate, he did not hedge, he attacked. Not in a frenzied, uncoordinated way, not in the reckless manner that his critics always accused him of, but with a precision and a ferocity that made absolutely clear to anyone watching that this was a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. He pushed the American Tude Corps forward with an intensity that shocked even his own officers. He drove north, driving hard toward the coast at Bizerte, executing a flanking movement that would, if successful, cut off a significant portion of the German forces in Tunisia and contribute to the collapse of the entire Axis position in North Africa. He moved armor through terrain that German commanders had assessed as largely impassable for large armored formations because Patton had looked at the same terrain and seen something different. He'd seen speed, he'd seen surprise, he'd seen the look on a German commander's face when tanks appeared from a direction nobody thought tanks could come from. The American Second Corps captured Bizerte on May 7, 1943, the same day that British forces captured Tunis. Within days, the entire Axis force in North Africa had collapsed. Over 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in what became known as Tunisgrad, a reference to the catastrophic German defeat at Stalingrad just months earlier. It was the largest surrender of Axis forces in the entire war. And von Arnim, the man who had tried to use the memory of Kasserine to push Patton back, who had tried to intimidate the American forces into hesitation and eventually retreat, was himself taken prisoner. He was captured not in some dramatic battlefield confrontation, but in the mundane, humiliating way that military collapses usually end. He was found by British soldiers on a hillside, his command structure dissolved, his army gone, his war over. He was flown to England, interrogated, and spent the rest of the conflict as a prisoner of war. When British officers brought von Arnim to meet with British commanders after his capture, there is a reported exchange that tells you almost everything you need to know about the gap between what the Germans had expected and what they got. Von Arnim, still processing the scale of what had happened, is said to have expressed something very close to disbelief. Not at the fighting quality of the British forces, whom he had faced for years and respected, but at the Americans, at the speed and aggression with which they had moved. At the transformation in American fighting capability that had occurred between Kasserine in February and Bizerte in May. 3 months. That's how long it took Patton to take a shattered, demoralized corps and turn it into a force that helped seal the fate of 250,000 Axis soldiers. 3 months. But to really understand the magnitude of this, to really appreciate why this confrontation matters, you need to understand the mechanics of what Patton actually did. Not just the broad strokes of the campaign, but the specific ways in which he dismantled the German approach and replaced German confidence with German confusion. The first thing Patton understood was that the Germans were operating on the assumption of American predictability. After Kasserine, they believed they knew how American forces would respond to pressure. They would consolidate. They would call for air support. They would wait for everything to be in perfect order before moving. They would telegraph their intentions through cautious, methodical movements, and if you hit them hard enough and fast enough in the right place, they would break. Patton's immediate priority was to make the Americans unpredictable, and the way he did that was through relentless forward movement. He pushed. He pushed when his supply situation was uncertain. He pushed when the terrain was challenging. He pushed when other commanders would have paused to reassess. He pushed, not because he was reckless, but because he understood, at a cellular level, that in armored warfare, momentum is a form of protection. A moving target is harder to destroy than a stationary one. A force in motion is harder to predict than a force waiting for orders. He also understood something about the German command culture that most American commanders of the time did not, which was that German tactical excellence at the unit level was frequently undermined by their assumptions about their opponents. German commanders were extraordinarily good at responding to situations they had anticipated. They were trained, brilliantly, to execute complex combined arms maneuvers against the kinds of threats they had been told to expect. But they had a tendency, not universal, but real, to underestimate the speed with which an opponent could change the terms of the engagement. Patton's entire operational philosophy was built around changing the terms faster than the enemy could adapt. The second thing Patton understood was the psychological dimension of command presence. This is something that tends to get dismissed as theater or performance, and in one sense it was. But theater, performed at the right moment in front of the right audience, can have genuine operational consequences. Patton knew that his soldiers needed to believe they were part of something extraordinary. He knew that belief affects behavior. He knew that a soldier who believes he is fighting for a legendary commander in a legendary army will do things that a soldier who believes he is just another piece on a board will not. So he showed up. He showed up at forward positions when most generals were at the rear. He showed up in his famous command vehicle with the flags flying and the horns honking. He showed up looking like exactly what he wanted his soldiers to believe they were fighting for. And he was profane, and he was demanding, and he was harsh. But he was there. And his soldiers knew he was there. And that knowledge moved through formations like electricity. The Germans knew his reputation, and that was also calculated. Patton did not accidentally develop a reputation as the most aggressive armored commander in the American army. He cultivated it deliberately, because he understood that a general's reputation, if properly managed, precedes him into battle. If German commanders believed they were about to face something unprecedented, something aggressive and fast and unpredictable, they would make cautious decisions. They would hedge. They would hold reserves back that might otherwise be committed to the attack. The perception of ferocity has a deterrent effect, and Patton understood this with a sophistication that is genuinely impressive. Now let's talk about what happened after Tunisia, because the story of Patton and German intimidation attempts doesn't end in North Africa. It extends through Sicily and into northwestern Europe in ways that become, if anything, even more dramatic. Because after Tunisia, the Germans had direct evidence of what Patton was capable of, and yet, astonishingly, some of them tried again. The Sicilian campaign of July and August 1943, Operation Husky, is one of the fastest and most breathtaking advances in the history of American military operations. And it almost didn't happen the way it did, because the original plan gave Patton's 7th Army a secondary role, supporting the British 8th Army under Montgomery, which would drive up the eastern coast of the island, while the Americans protected their flank. It was, from Patton's perspective, a humiliating assignment, and it was, from a purely tactical standpoint, questionable, because it left the western half of Sicily essentially open. Patton saw the opening and went through it like a freight train. When the British advance on the eastern coast stalled against determined German resistance, Patton got permission from Harold Alexander, the Allied ground commander, to conduct what was technically a reconnaissance in force to the northwest. He took that permission and ran with it in the most literal possible sense. He drove his forces so fast, across such difficult terrain, against such determined German rearguard actions, that even his own corps commanders sometimes had trouble keeping up with his intentions. He captured Palermo on July 22, 1943, just 11 days after the invasion began, in a dramatic, rolling advance that covered over 100 miles and netted 53,000 prisoners. And then he raced the British to Messina. This is the part of the Sicilian campaign that tends to dominate the popular memory, the race between Patton and Montgomery for the strategic city at the northeastern tip of the island. But what gets lost in the narrative of personal rivalry and inter-allied friction is the military reality of what Patton was doing. He was conducting a sustained offensive at a pace that the German defenders, despite their extraordinary individual fighting capability, simply could not match. German armored counterattacks that would have stopped a more cautious commander in his tracks were bypassed, absorbed, or simply outrun. German defensive lines that were expertly positioned and professionally manned were breached not by massive firepower, but by relentless forward pressure and the refusal to give the defenders time to consolidate. When Patton entered Messina on August 17th, ahead of the British, it was not merely a personal triumph or a point scored in an inter-allied competition. It was the completion of a campaign that had conquered an island of approximately 10,000 square miles, with a garrison of over 300,000 Axis troops, in 38 days. The speed was staggering. The cost in American lives was real and significant, and Patton was never cavalier about casualties in the way his critics sometimes suggested. But the speed also meant that the German forces never had the opportunity to establish the kind of deep defensive system that would have made the campaign immeasurably more costly. Now here is where we need to address something directly, because any honest account of Patton has to reckon with the slapping incidents. In Sicily, in August 1943, Patton visited 2 field hospitals and encountered 2 soldiers who had been diagnosed with what was then called battle fatigue, what we would now recognize as combat stress reaction, or PTSD. In both cases, he berated the soldiers, called them cowards, and in one instance slapped one of them. The incidents were reported, they reached Eisenhower, and they very nearly ended Patton's career. For weeks, Eisenhower wrestled with what to do. He reprimanded Patton privately, required him to apologize to the men, the officers present, and the assembled troops of his divisions. He suppressed the story from the press for as long as possible, and then the journalist Drew Pearson broke it, and it became a public scandal that consumed American newspapers for weeks and generated enormous pressure for Patton to be relieved permanently. Eisenhower kept him. Not without serious reservations, not without genuine anger at what Patton had done, but because Eisenhower understood something that the public debate over the slapping incidents often missed. Patton was not replaceable, not in the way that mattered, not as a fighting general at the highest level of operational art. He could be replaced in an administrative sense, certainly. Any competent officer could be given command of an army and manage its logistics and coordinate its movements. But the specific quality that made Patton's armies move the way they moved, that quality was not transferable. It was not a technique that could be taught in a staff college. It was something particular to this specific man, with his particular obsessions and his particular kind of courage, and his particular understanding of armored warfare at its most aggressive. And Eisenhower was going to need that quality in the campaign that was coming. The campaign that would be the defining event of the war in the West, the campaign for northwestern Europe. But here is the thing that the Germans did next, which is one of the most fascinating and least appreciated chapters in the entire history of the Second World War. After Tunisia, after Sicily, after every demonstration that Patton was exactly as dangerous as his reputation suggested, the German high command became so afraid of Patton that they essentially built their defensive strategy around the assumption that he would lead the main Allied invasion of northwestern Europe. They fixated on him, they tracked him, they reported his movements to Hitler, they revised their assessments of Allied intentions based on where Patton appeared to be and what he appeared to be doing. And the Allied deception planners, specifically the architects of Operation Fortitude, the massive deception operation designed to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings were a feint and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, used that fixation with devastating effectiveness. They made Patton the centerpiece of their deception. They created a fictional army group, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, put Patton in nominal command of it, and planted radio traffic, double agents, and deliberate leaks designed to make the Germans believe that the main Allied invasion would be led by the most feared American general in the war. It worked beyond anyone's expectations. German intelligence, surveilling Allied preparations and processing the information from their agents, many of whom had been turned and were now feeding them carefully crafted disinformation, concluded that the Normandy landings were indeed a feint and that the real blow, the decisive blow, would come at Pas de Calais, led by Patton. Hitler himself held back the panzer divisions that might have pushed the Allies back into the sea on June 6th and in the critical days following, because he was waiting for the real invasion, the one Patton would lead, the one that never came. Think about that for a moment. The German fear of Patton was so total, so complete, so deeply embedded in their intelligence assessments and their operational planning that it became a strategic asset for the Allies. His reputation, the reputation he had built through Tunisia and Sicily and years of deliberate self-mythology, was weaponized against the people who feared him. And that weaponization contributed directly to the success of the largest amphibious operation in human history. But the story doesn't stop at D-Day, because eventually, Patton was given a real army and pointed at real Germans. And what happened next was the most spectacular sustained offensive in American military history. The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Operation Cobra, created the opportunity that Patton had been waiting for. The German lines, compressed and battered by weeks of brutal fighting in the hedgerow country, broke under the weight of massive American air power and ground assault. And into that break poured Patton's Third Army, activated on August 1st, 1944, the same day Patton officially took command. What followed in the next weeks was almost unreal in its speed and scope. Third Army's tanks raced across France with an aggression that left the German defenders permanently off balance. Patton was not interested in capturing ground in the methodical, set-piece way that characterized so much of the Normandy campaign. He was interested in breaking things, in moving faster than the Germans could react, in getting behind their defensive positions before they could establish them, in cutting off retreating formations before they could regroup and become dangerous again. By August 13th, Third Army had swept through Brittany, driven south to the Loire River, and was driving east toward the Seine with a momentum that was beginning to look, to terrified German commanders, like something they could not stop with anything they had. German commanders in France, who had spent months preparing defensive positions and training their troops to hold against the inevitable Allied offensive, now found themselves being asked to improvise defenses against an enemy who was already behind them, already on their flanks, already at the bridges they needed to escape across. And here is where the intimidation question comes back with full force, because the German commanders facing Patton in France in August 1944 were not inexperienced officers trying to bluff their way through a difficult situation. They were some of the most capable and experienced military professionals in the world. Men who had fought in Poland, in France in 1940, in the Balkans on the Eastern Front. Men who had learned from the most brutal school of war that the 20th century had yet produced. And yet, report after report from German commanders during this period reflects the same bewildered note, the same sense that they were dealing with something that was not operating within the normal parameters of military engagement. One captured German officer, whose account was translated and distributed within the Third Army intelligence apparatus, described Patton's forces as moving like water finding every crack. He meant it as a tactical observation, a description of how Patton's armor seemed to flow around resistance rather than stopping to attack it directly, bypassing strong points to maintain momentum and leaving them to be mopped up by following infantry. But it also captured something psychological. The disorienting quality of facing an enemy who refused to behave the way enemies were supposed to behave, who did not stop when they were supposed to stop, who did not consolidate when every military logic suggested consolidation was required, who kept coming and coming and coming, regardless of what was thrown in front of them. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 is one of the most dramatic episodes of the entire Western campaign, and it illustrates this quality in Patton perfectly. As German Army Group B attempted to withdraw from Normandy, Allied forces closed in from north and south, with the Americans driving north from Argentan and the Canadians and British driving south toward Falaise. If the gap could be closed completely, the entire German force in Normandy would be trapped, upwards of 2 German armies. Hundreds of thousands of men, the majority of the Wehrmacht's fighting strength in the west. Patton's forces reached Argentan first and could have driven north to close the gap, which is exactly what Patton wanted to do. He reportedly told Bradley that he could drive to the German border in 3 days if allowed to continue. Bradley stopped him, concerned about a collision with the Canadians driving south. The gap was not fully closed. Somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 Germans managed to escape through what became known as the Falaise Gap before the pocket was sealed, although they escaped largely without their heavy equipment and at catastrophic cost in men killed or captured. The Germans who did escape reported something that appears repeatedly in the accounts of the Falaise Pocket, which is a kind of stunned disbelief at the speed with which American armor had appeared and the ferocity with which it fought. German officers who had been completely confident in their ability to conduct an orderly withdrawal found themselves running, not retreating in a military sense, running, abandoning vehicles, equipment, wounded men, trying to find any gap through which they could escape before the Americans cut them off completely. Patton was furious about the decision to halt at Argentan. He believed, and many historians have subsequently agreed, that the complete closure of the Falaise Pocket would have ended the war in the West months earlier than it actually ended. But even with the gap open, the destruction of German forces in the Falaise Pocket was catastrophic. Estimates of German casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, range from 60,000 to 80,000 men, with enormous losses in tanks, artillery, and vehicles. The German forces that escaped were shadows of their former selves. and Third Army kept going, across France, toward the Seine, toward the Moselle, toward the German border itself. By September 1944, Third Army had advanced further and faster than any army in the history of American military operations. In less than 3 months since activation, it had liberated most of France, driven almost to Germany, and had destroyed or captured an enormous quantity of German combat power. And then came the supply crisis. And here, for a moment, the pace had to slow. Because the Allied logistical system, never designed for an advance of this speed across this distance, simply could not keep up. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system that ran day and night to move fuel and ammunition to the front, was a heroic achievement. But it was not enough. Patton's Third Army, out at the tip of the Allied advance, ran out of gasoline and was forced to halt just as it was poised to cross the Moselle and drive into Germany. Patton's frustration during this period was incandescent. He believed, and again, many historians have agreed, that the Allied supply crisis was at least partly the result of priorities. That fuel was being allocated to Montgomery's forces in the north for Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne operation in the Netherlands, at the expense of what Patton believed was a more direct route to victory. He argued, loudly and not always diplomatically, that his Third Army, if given adequate fuel, could breach the Siegfried Line and drive into Germany before the Wehrmacht could reconstitute itself after the disasters of the summer. He was probably right. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that the forced halt gave the Germans time. Time to reinforce their defenses, time to bring fresh divisions to the west, time to prepare the Siegfried Line for defense. And when Patton's Third Army finally resumed its advance with sufficient supplies, the campaign became much harder. The fighting in the Lorraine region in the fall of 1944 was brutal, attritional, nothing like the spectacular armored sweeps of August. The Germans had recovered their equilibrium, and even against Patton, a recovered and entrenched German defense was a formidable thing. But even in this harder fighting, the pattern was consistent. German commanders facing Third Army consistently reported the same thing. Patton's forces were different. They were more aggressive. They were faster to exploit opportunities. They were less likely to stop and consolidate when a defensive German response appeared. And when German commanders tried the tactics that had worked against other Allied formations, the probing attacks, the counterattacks designed to create caution, the exploitation of flanks to force withdrawals, Third Army did not respond the way it was supposed to. It responded with more aggression, with a counteraggression that was almost always more violent and more rapid than the Germans had prepared for. And then came December 1944, and the Battle of the Bulge, and the moment that cemented Patton's place in history as something beyond even what Tunisia and Sicily and the race across France had established. The German Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble in the West, struck the American lines on December 16, 1944, and immediately created a crisis. The German assault, striking through the Ardennes in the worst weather of the winter, hit American formations that were unprepared, under strength, and in some cases shocked into confusion. Within days, the Germans had torn a massive gap in the Allied line, surrounded the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, and were driving toward the Meuse River and the vital supply ports of Antwerp. The Allied response was initially frantic. Bradley's headquarters was caught off guard. Eisenhower's initial reaction was confused. At the Critical Command Conference at Verdun on December 19th, with the crisis at its most acute, Eisenhower asked his commanders how soon they could counterattack to relieve Bastogne. Most of the commanders in the room thought in terms of weeks. The logistics were complicated, the weather was terrible, the situation was unclear. Moving large formations in winter, through snow and ice, in the face of an active German offensive, was a massive undertaking that normally required weeks of preparation. Patton said he could do it in 3 days. The room fell silent. Then, according to multiple accounts, there was laughter. Not from Eisenhower, who knew Patton well enough to know that when he made a specific operational promise, he usually kept it, but from others in the room who found the claim simply incredible. A full Army Corps, pivoting 90 degrees from its current axis of advance, moving through winter conditions against an active German attack, and reaching Bastogne in 72 hours? It was not possible. What the people laughing did not know was that Patton had already been planning it. For 3 days, while the German offensive was still developing and most commanders were still trying to understand what was happening, Patton had been quietly preparing 3 separate contingency plans for counterattacking in the Ardennes, depending on how the German assault developed. He had identified the routes. He had pre-positioned the logistics. He had briefed his corps commanders in enough detail that when he called them from Verdun to give the execute order, they already knew what to do. He had done all of this before he was asked, before he was given permission, before anyone else in the Allied High Command was thinking about counterattack because they were all still absorbing the scale of the crisis. On December 22, 1944, 3 days after the Verdun Conference, the leading elements of Patton's Third Army began to reach Bastogne. On December 26, the 4th Armored Division broke through the German ring and relieved the surrounded garrison, the fastest and most complex administrative movement of a large military formation in the history of the American Army, executed in winter, in snow and ice, against an active enemy offensive, in 72 hours. The Germans had tried to use the Ardennes offensive to break the Allied will, to demonstrate that even in late 1944, even after all the losses of the summer, the Wehrmacht could still deliver a blow that would force the Allies to reconsider. It was, in a sense, one final attempt at the kind of psychological intimidation that had worked so well in the early years of the war, and it failed. Partly because of the extraordinary resistance of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, partly because of Allied air power when the weather cleared, partly because of the eventual weight of Allied material superiority. But significantly, importantly, in a way that became one of the defining images of the entire Western campaign, it failed because of Patton, because of the man who had looked at an impossible timeline and said 3 days, and then did it in 3 days. After Bastogne, Third Army did not stop. It drove north into the German flank, and east and northeast, crashing through what remained of German resistance in the west, with a ferocity that had not diminished at all, despite the hard fighting of the fall and the extraordinary exertions of the Ardennes. In March 1945, Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim, ahead of Montgomery's much more elaborate crossing in the north, and Patton made sure the crossing was announced with maximum drama. He reportedly stopped in the middle of the pontoon bridge, urinated into the Rhine River, and announced that he was doing something that Napoleon had not been able to do. This is, historically, almost certainly accurate and entirely characteristic. Third Army drove deep into Germany, captured enormous numbers of prisoners, and overran territory at a pace that, once again, left German commanders struggling to establish any coherent defense. The Wehrmacht in the West was not the force that had stopped the Allies at the Moselle in the fall. It was broken, demoralized, and being pursued by an army that had been at war for 3 years and had gotten, if anything, more aggressive rather than less. Patton's forces discovered the Ohrdruf concentration camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald, on April 4, 1945, the first Nazi concentration camp to be liberated by American forces. Patton insisted that local German civilians and every American soldier in the area who was not in the line tour the camp and see what had been done there. He himself reportedly became physically ill at what he saw. The man who had never flinched from the violence of the battlefield, who had written poetry about the glory of combat, was undone by the calculated, systematic, bureaucratic horror of the camps. It changed something in him, or perhaps revealed something that had always been there beneath the performance of martial enthusiasm. Third Army continued east until May 1945, when Germany surrendered and the war in Europe ended. By that point, Third Army had been operational for 9 months and 11 days. In that time, it had advanced further than any other Allied army. It had captured or destroyed more German divisions than any other American formation. It had covered over 1,500 miles of combat advance. It had taken over 750,000 prisoners. The numbers are staggering, and they belong to the thousands of soldiers, the corps commanders, the division commanders, the regimental and battalion leaders, and the individual soldiers who fought and bled and died in Third Army's campaigns. But the character of what Third Army did, the speed, the aggression, the refusal to give the enemy time to react, that belonged to Patton. After the war ended, Patton created political problems almost immediately. He made comments suggesting that German soldiers were not fundamentally different from American soldiers, which outraged the public and his superiors. He suggested that former Nazis might be useful in the coming confrontation with the Soviets, an opinion that, while historically interesting, was spectacularly inappropriate for a serving military commander to voice publicly in 1945. Eisenhower relieved him of command of 3rd Army and gave him the less operationally significant 15th Army, a headquarters primarily tasked with writing the official history of the war in Europe. Patton was angry. He felt sidelined, discarded, treated as if his usefulness was at an end, now that the shooting had stopped. He talked about resigning. He talked about going to the Pacific. He talked about the future in terms that made his staff nervous. And then on December 9, 1945, just over 6 months after the German surrender, he was involved in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. A U.S. Army truck turned in front of his car. The impact was not particularly violent at low speed. Patton's driver and the other man in the vehicle were uninjured, but Patton suffered a severe fracture and dislocation of his cervical spine and was